I remember walking through the middle of town here at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, and it was like being in a zombie movie. You know, there was no one there. Originally, if you had a business manager visa, you'd often get caught in this situation of, oh, I need a bank account, but to get a bank account, I need an address. But to get an address, I need a bank account, and I can't solve that.
Then did you consider like moving to Tokyo or going to Kansai or somewhere else? And what kept you in Fukuoka?
One thing is, if you look at maybe the basic living costs in Fukuoka, you could move to Tokyo, but you'd double your rent. We can host events where you'll only get 3 people. You know, we can host an event for something really obscure. It's like, hey, you like APL and vector programming languages? Get in here. We had a great thunderous start, and then COVID hit.
Welcome to the Japan Dev Podcast. I am Eric, founder of japandev.com. And today I am chatting with Laurie Griffiths, who is a software engineer who's been in Japan for about a decade, and he's actually living in Fukuoka. And he has been doing some very interesting stuff here in Japan, and I'm super excited to get into this discussion with Laurie. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. So just to start off, I guess let's just talk about your kind of early life a little bit. You were born in England, is that right?
I'm originally from Nottingham, England. I ended up going to Cambridge University to do computer science. Originally I was trying to do physics, but I made this sort of sideways switch to computer science when you got better toys and less math.
You actually started out on the physics track and decided to switch into computer science partway through.
Which I think is not the most uncommon switch. But I think mainly because I didn't know much about computer science as a thing to study. I'd actually been interested in programming for a long time before that. But I was kind of looking at my school classes and said, oh, okay, I like physics, I like science, let's go do that. When really computer science was an option that maybe back in those days didn't get quite as much publicity as it does now.
Yeah. It is interesting how we have to make such an enormous decision at such a young age. And it totally makes sense that you would kind of make it based on the context that you have, which was kind of your high school, right? You're schooling up until that point, which is like, oh, these are the classes. It was physics and it was chemistry and it was whatever, math, and not be thinking as focused on the industries and everything that are out there. So I think it's a good switch. I did something very similar. Actually, I started as an electrical engineer major. And then after like 2 years was like, I like some aspects of this, but when I'm actually looking at the job prospects and stuff, I think maybe just going to the computer side makes more sense. And I switched to computer engineering. So I guess what was your like initial exposure, I guess, to Japan that kind of planted the seed of maybe you would want to live here someday, or at least had like an interest in Japan?
I think, growing up in the 90s in the UK, there was a lot of cultural influence from Japan. I remember going and playing the first Pokemon games and Game Boy, and just Japan was like culturally very sort of well known. And I think I'd always had a bit of a side interest in that. But interestingly, maybe during my high school, languages, so foreign languages, was my least favorite subject by a long way. We did French and German. I think I did German for 5 years in high school and really, really didn't like it. Like, surprisingly so. But then after getting to university, I lived with someone who spoke Swedish and I studied Swedish there. And I realized maybe late in the game that, a language is a thing you can study and learn and do lots of interesting stuff with, which kind of led on to me applying to sort of study abroad and scholarships at the end of university, which is kind of what brought me to Japan in the end. So I finished my computer science course and wanted to do something different before maybe starting work and doing all that sort of stuff. So I applied to the scholarship and got accepted. And that was a scholarship to come to a university here in Fukuoka and study Japanese essentially full time. And they paid for accommodation and study fees and things like that. So it was a real great opportunity to, learn another language.
So it wasn't even necessarily Japanese specifically that got you interested in this opportunity. You were studying Swedish, and it was more just this revelation that like, wow, languages, foreign languages are actually really cool, and I'm interested in them, it turns out. And maybe that combined with this vague idea in the back of your head of like, Pokemon is cool and whatever. There's, Japan is very different from where you grew up, and if you're going to have this idea of like, I want to get out of where I was, born for at least a while and really see some different part of the world, I think it makes sense to go kind of on the opposite extreme and be like, hey, they don't even use like alphabet characters here. It's like these kanji and like they're they have this whole long culture that's like, long history and culture that's so totally different from like what I'm used to. So I think that makes sense. So you kind of zeroed in on Japan, I guess, as a result of that. And you did this Suzuki scholarship at the Japan University of Economics in Fukuoka, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that was a year, essentially, studying full time, and we had maybe 3 or 4 hours of classes per day, designed to try and take you from zero Japanese up to some reasonable level. And I would try and put in extra study time as well, because I thought, well, if I'm going to come here and do this, I want to use the language, speak to people. And I lived in a Japanese dormitory. You know, we had the big sort of shared bath, and we had the sort of one breakfast and dinner was all kind of one menu, so you get used to the Japanese food very quickly. And everyone around you, there's lots of Korean exchange students and Chinese exchange students, so lots of great chances to talk to people in Japanese as well. It was a really great opportunity, and by the end of the year, I took the JLPT, and I nearly, but didn't quite get level 2. This was before N1 and 2, this was 2. But I felt like I had made a lot of progress in a relatively short amount of time, like less than a year.
Did you start from pretty much nothing?
Pretty much. I had done things like the Pimsleur CDs that teach you, some kind of basic phrases. Where is the station? I still think they're very good way to get started.
They're not bad. Yeah.
And I'd looked at some textbooks and things. I think remembering the kanji, the book was kind of in the library, and I had seen that was a really interesting way to just like get used to all these new characters. And I would practice handwriting a lot as well. Before classes I would kind of go to the library and practice handwriting, which is interesting because I can't really write anything by hand now. So it's kind of gone. It's weird how that kind of comes and goes if you don't use it.
I had the exact same experience. I actually learned to write kanji from remembering the kanji. I had like these notebooks. They were like math notebooks with little squares in them, and I would just fill page after page after page of these like remembering the kanji keywords and stuff. And I had all these flashcards and whatnot. And for like a good 6 months there, I could write literally every Joyo kanji, like all 2,000 plus of them. And then very quickly, I just lost the ability to do that. Now I could probably write like 100 or 200 of them total, because I just didn't use it for a decade straight.
But I think it's a great way to start because it takes away the fear of the kanji. I think a lot of people, they go, okay, I'll learn hiragana, I can do that. I'll learn katakana, I can do that. And then they go, well, kanji, I'll do that a little bit later. Or, I'll learn 10. And just going, no, I'm going to just learn 1,000 or 2,000 is a good place to go to because, you're going to forget loads of them. But it just, you start seeing the patterns, you start seeing, on the left side, this gets repeated a lot. And it just makes everything feel a lot more familiar when you're trying to read things.
Yeah, exactly. I think without having done some version of that, they just, the characters tend to all kind of merge together because it's harder to pick out the different radicals because you haven't like looked at them in isolation as much and stuff. So it can be tough. So I recommend doing, there's a bunch of different programs. I think there's probably some that are a bit more efficient now. It's a bit controversial, I think, the whole like RTK method at this point, but I think it's still a good way to be able to recognize the characters and stuff. So that's cool.
I think there's no real shortcut to just doing lots, learning lots of words, learning lots of kanji, you've got to do it one way or the other.
So you did that 1 year, and I don't know, I guess you were, like you said, living in the dorm, and you were on the scholarship, so it wasn't like a major expense or anything like that. So I guess there was probably not much friction in terms of like getting settled in Japan, right? Or was there? Or did you have any issues like,
Well, so I did the year, and people on my course with me, and lots of people were going back to the UK and doing further education and academia or just work. But I thought, no, I think I'm going to try and stay here a little bit longer. Again, partly for the language side of things. I felt like, I'm pretty close to really getting okay at Japanese and being able to speak it, which was this kind of goal of mine. So I thought, I'll just stay another year. And essentially, I rented an apartment, which was quite straightforward, picked up various odd jobs, doing all sorts of things, and managed to renew my visa or change my visa. At the time, it was a humanities visa.
Let's talk a little bit more about the visa, actually. Because I guess for that first year, it's pretty straightforward. You can get a student visa while you're studying, and that makes things easy for the first year. But basically, the second that you stop learning from the school, you have to, like you said, switch over. And if you get a full-time job at that point, then the typical way to then get a visa is to have the company sponsor you. But it sounds like you were doing like odd jobs. So how were you able to get that next visa?
Yeah, I think, and I'll caveat this by saying I wouldn't say this is advice or recommendation, it's just what I did at the time. I went to immigration professional, judicial scrivener, and they helped do some paperwork. We put together contracts for these odd jobs that I was doing, and we wrote the details of the companies and what I was doing and my income, and explained it in a way that immigration officers would understand. And essentially, that is how I managed to change it. And so I got a 1-year residency status in that first year. I think it wouldn't work today. I think if you were doing it today, they probably wouldn't let you do it. I think maybe things were just a bit more lax. This was 2012. I think just a bit more relaxed back then.
Was the process basically like getting invoices and contracts and things like that from your various jobs and kind of proving that you could support yourself by like cobbling together various evidence to kind of show that? Or like what was like I guess the requirement that you had to like kind of prove that you were like able to stay?
I mean, this was essentially it was that it was contracts, it was proving you had enough money that you'd be able to stay and pay tax and pay health insurance and afford your rent and not cause trouble. I mean, I remember at the time I was tutoring some children of a company employee, and he was a sort of foreign national, but so he wanted his kids tutored in English. We did science and maths in English. And the immigration officers wanted to see a copy of his residence card, or alien registration card it would have been back then. So quite a substantial amount of paperwork. I would say back in those days I would do renewals and there'd be close to 100 pages for some of the renewals.
So did you just get like a 1-year visa, or how did that work?
Yeah, in that time I got a 1-year visa, and I would say, I've been kind of unlucky, or just maybe because of my situation, I've had a lot of 1-year visas. And we can maybe go into that as we talk about the work. And this is why I would say I don't recommend doing this unless you kind of have a really good reason to try and follow this path. I think it doesn't fit well with immigration system and the immigration rules. And when I was first doing it, I wasn't even sure if I was going to get a renewal. I would often think, is this the time they're going to say, no, you have to go in 2 months? Things have definitely secured in my current situation and how I prove it. But it is still a source of frustration when you can, for instance, I was here for more than 10 years, but I was on a 1-year visa when that happened, so I couldn't apply for permanent residency. So it can limit you in some ways like that.
So that's really interesting that there is that gray area where it's like if you get the scrivener and maybe a lawyer or whatever you need to help you, and you kind of create some evidence to just kind of logically prove that you are able to take care of yourself and pay for your day-to-day life and pay taxes and all that stuff, that like there is some leeway, even if you don't necessarily have like a company that has hired you to work full-time that is like taking responsibility and sponsoring you. That's cool though. I mean, it's good to know that even if it's not the ideal situation, maybe it is an option, for people in that kind of gray area where they're trying to, do freelance or not be working full-time at one specific company, that, maybe they can still get a visa that way.
Yeah. I think there's maybe a bit of survivorship bias as well. You're talking to me because it worked out for so many years.
Right.
And I wonder how many people doing similar things had a year when it didn't work out and they had to leave the country. So if anyone's thinking about it, there's that to think about as well.
That's very interesting, though. I haven't heard too many data points similar to that. Usually you ultimately need to have some like kind of specific company to kind of sign off on it for you. So it's still good to hear all the various ways that people have made it happen. So, but yeah, you mentioned that you're doing a bunch of odd jobs, but I guess I would like to get a little bit more into that. Like specifically, what kind of jobs did you then kind of transfer into after the language school ended?
Yeah.
Like what exactly were you doing day to day?
So after, there was the kind of moving out of the dorms, doing odd jobs and really just sort of picking up whatever work I could. The next step for me was really getting involved with the tech community down here in Fukuoka. One of the place called IPE Cafe, which no longer exists, but it was a sort of co-working space, hacker space in the center of Fukuoka that was kind of a bit of a focal point for many kind of Fukuoka communities. And I went to a lot of tech events there, just a very small sort of nondescript room in a building somewhere in between a bunch of restaurants and bars. That's where I met a lot of the people that I still know in the community these days. And it's where my first job, my first kind of tech job in Japan came from. And this was at a small startup in Fukuoka doing sort of management software for care managers. So the sort of person who'd be organizing healthcare for maybe an elderly person, and not just healthcare, things like meal delivery and transport and all this other stuff. Even now it's a very paper-based job, but back then it was very, very paper-based. And I was working in that startup in the tech side of things.
What was the actual work like? I guess, like, what kind of tech stack were you using, and like, what was like maybe the, I guess, work-life balance? Like, what was the environment like?
The tech stack was the Java-based sort of web application was the kind of main stuff, and then we had like an Android app. Okay. And I was also just doing a lot. People who work in a startup will know that a lot of odd jobs, a lot of things to just support other people. Because we had a sort of team of people going around talking directly to care managers, and so they would need something doing, fixing, sorting out, and just random scripting and edits and things like that. So I would say that at that time the work-life balance was pretty good. I think you hear a lot of kind of stories about people getting stuck into really, really bad overtime situations, but I didn't experience that. And I also think maybe startups, you have a bit more leeway in what you can negotiate with. Maybe they can't offer the big salary that a big tech company can, but they can offer flexible working arrangements. They can offer, these days, I guess, remote work. You can have them make concessions to help fit into your lifestyle if that's what you value, and probably more so than a big tech company.
Was that part of why you chose a smaller startup? I mean, to be honest, like in my case, I actually started a very small startup as well. I worked as an English teacher for a year and then switched into being a software engineer. And I had studied computer engineering, but like my degree had gotten a bit stale, as I was working as an English teacher and everything. So I didn't have a lot of options, to be 100% honest. I don't think I could have walked into a lot of the bigger, well-known companies. And it was more like I had to kind of search in the more domestic Japanese-speaking startup industry. Would you say that you had the option of working at a larger company? I mean, with the background with Cambridge and everything, the strong Japanese skills, I feel like you likely would have.
Yeah, I think I had more options back then. And at the time there was a few bigger tech companies that are now big, really starting to take off in Fukuoka, and there were options there. And I think I chose it because of the team, and I chose it because of the people to work with there. And that's maybe been a bit of a theme through the first few jobs I had in startups. I went on from there to working in another startup. It was actually, the founder was a foreigner who'd lived in Fukuoka for a long time, and that was a sort of media content management system based startup. And it was very Ruby on Rails heavy. I think Ruby on Rails at the time was huge in Fukuoka, about 10 years ago now. That was actually probably my biggest learning experience in terms of tech. I worked with a very experienced developer who was a contractor, and he taught me, many, many things about actual development, test-driven development and CI/CD and all these other pieces that you maybe don't get to experience as much in college when you're doing the theory.
Yeah, I feel like the Ruby on Rails wave kind of coincided with this like TDD, test-driven development, clean code, whatever, like kind of focus on better designed code and like more maintainable code and, less tech debt, and like maybe this kind of philosophy around that too. I don't know if that was like a Ruby thing or if it was just the timelines matched up or what. But I feel like before that, it was kind of wild, wild west. A lot of crazy like PHP spaghetti code that is just trying to write as little code as possible to just get the elements that you need up on the web page or whatever it is, And then like jQuery for the JavaScript side. And then I feel like it kind of ushered in this more intentional code quality focused era, right? With at least here in Japan when Rails was really big. So I think that persists to this day. I mean, the popularity of Rails has obviously decreased a bit since then. It's not in its heyday anymore. It's still relatively popular among startups and stuff, especially. But that is really interesting.
Yeah, there's still some Rails startups and bigger companies now in Fukuoka with a lot of Rails code bases doing some interesting things. Rails used to be the new hotness, and now it is the kind of old legacy thing. But there's also a certain sense of stability and kind of ease of hiring, ease of maintenance to these projects. So, yeah.
It sounds like initially you didn't have any kind of like deep connection with Fukuoka. You just had this scholarship that was a great opportunity and that happened to be in Fukuoka. But then I guess after your initial 1 year studying Japanese period ended, you had the ability to also go somewhere else within Japan. And you decided to stay in Fukuoka and really start your tech career there too. What was the thinking behind that? And did you consider like moving to Tokyo or going to, Kansai or somewhere else? And what kept you in Fukuoka? And like, what were you kind of hoping to do by staying there in that community there?
Yeah, I do remember in that time, so after I'd moved in out of the dorm and into Fukuoka and maybe working at a startup, I did go up to Tokyo to one of the international careers events that they had at the time. And I remember, every time I go up to Tokyo, I'm always just shocked by how many people there are there and how busy it is. And the event was the same. And I went round and talked to a bunch of different Japanese companies, big and small. There was a corner for all the startups, and then there was the bigger companies. And I remember talking to a tech company that essentially made peripherals, and hearing the talk where he started it by explaining to everyone like what a peripheral is. And I just felt like this isn't the kind of an engineer hacker energy that I'm looking for. Is like if you've come and sat down in this talk and you don't really know what a peripheral is, maybe it's not for me. And I was much more excited by the startups I spoke to there. But I think one thing is if you look at maybe just the sort of basic rent costs and just basic living costs in Fukuoka, you could move to Tokyo, but you'd double your rent. You would have to spend a lot more time commuting. So I would say, my time in Fukuoka, my average commute time has probably been sort of 10, 15 minutes, usually like walking and cycling. So it's really, really kind of good lifestyle for that. And I think when I was comparing startups and smaller companies that kind of like the vibe of, I didn't at the time see like a big gap in salaries. But again, at the time, salaries were generally quite low in Japan. They've definitely come up in the past few years, but at the time they were relatively on the low side.
Yeah, I think they've increased a bit since then, but they've increased both in Fukuoka and Tokyo as well.
Yeah.
And with the difference in cost of living, I think the salaries in Fukuoka are high enough. You're not going to feel like you're earning less than you would with a higher salary in Tokyo, right? So I don't think like financially there's that strong of a need to move to Tokyo. There are more companies here, especially now. I think it's grown, like the industry here has grown a lot. It's grown a lot in Fukuoka too, though, I understand. And I know that the government is doing a lot to incentivize startups to move there and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's a good place to be honest. You can get a lot more space, when you're renting an apartment or whatever, for a lot less money, which would be really nice. It's really tough in Tokyo, especially as you kind of grow older and you want more space. Maybe you want to have a family or something like that. It gets really tough. Whereas you can still do it pretty reasonably. Even with just a normal kind of salary there in Fukuoka, you can make that happen. In Tokyo, normally you have to kind of move out to the suburbs, really make a lot of concessions and keep have your family in a pretty tight place, right? So I could definitely see the appeal.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned Tokyo has more companies, I definitely think that's true, especially if you go to, you limit it to companies English-speaking.
Yeah.
If you're an English-speaking engineer and you're looking for opportunities, there are some companies down here in Fukuoka and more companies that are trying to do things like change their engineering teams to English, to hire more engineers from other countries. But in Tokyo, the difference is stark. You have international companies, and I think that just the average level of English is higher as well. I think here, Japanese language skills are quite necessary, not just for the work side of things, but also for the day-to-day life side of things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think if you look at only the English-speaking companies, there's a big difference. But you didn't have to do that. You were looking at the Japanese-speaking ones too. And as long as you're doing that, there are actually quite a few options in Fukuoka as well. So I think that is like a really important caveat. It's like not everyone is looking for that kind of English-speaking environment necessarily. They might be trying to work on their Japanese or whatever, have some goals where they would prefer to be in like that kind of environment and be the one person who can speak English, instead of like just using English all day or whatever. So yeah, I think that is a really good point. But it is really interesting that you kind of had that decision and stayed in Fukuoka and have continued to stay there. And I guess my question is like, have you really like fallen in love with it since then, or is it just like inertia, that kind of keeps you there? Or
a bit
like
of both.
what is like your
Definitely, there's a bit of inertia in there for sure. But I do think the lifestyle here for me and sort of day-to-day life is really nice. I have, like I say, very short commutes, or if I need to go anywhere, it saves me a lot of time day to day, but also it's very easy to meet up with friends, former colleagues, things like that. It's easy to grab lunch between on a work day, where I feel like in Tokyo you'd be an hour on the train to get to the other side and things like that. Yeah. It's got a bit of a sort of small village feeling, even though you're living in, it's a quite substantial city, 1 million plus people. But I constantly run into people I know every day, and yeah, it's a really nice experience. And it's kind of the community side of things is what really makes it for me.
So no plans to relocate to anywhere else in Japan at this point? You're pretty much settled there in Fukuoka, you think?
Well, I mean, never say never. With the increase in sort of remote work and abilities to be more mobile, I could definitely see a world where my base was in Fukuoka and I'm up in Tokyo for a bit. I'm over in London for a bit and kind of moving around more. Yeah.
I see. Cool. So you were doing so I guess you jumped around to a couple different startups. At some point, I think you also did some engagements with like a larger, kind of more well-known tech company as well. How did that kind of come about?
After working at a few of these startups, I think I had kind of seen how the sausage was made, so to speak. And I did have a bit of the idea of, well, why don't I try and do my own? So this was right at the same time when Fukuoka City was providing office space in a place called Fukuoka Growth Next and this startup support hub. So I also felt like, maybe it would kind of make my visa a little bit easier. I'll get a business manager visa and I'll run a small company. So I did a startup. I made a Kabushiki Gaisha, and we were making grammar checking software. If you've ever used something like Grammarly, then we were essentially making a similar product to that. And this was before ChatGPT and before LLMs, and this is kind of old school AI, if you want to call it that. Parsing sentences and rules and all these other things we were doing. And it was a really interesting experience. I would say we had a sort of the beginnings of a nice product, but also I had maybe underestimated how much other stuff you've got to do at a startup. And things, accounting and keeping on top of all this other sort of paperwork and just physically running the office and all these other things just take up a lot of time and take you away from the main focus. And of course, having and this was a kind of bootstrap self-funded venture, so I didn't have VC funding on that one. So you don't have sort of huge amounts of money to burn as well. So one of the things at the time, I had contacts in the community here with a bigger company who wanted sort of training and consulting for their engineering teams as they were trying to grow their engineering teams and internationalize their engineering teams. And I think that when I started doing that, they had something along the lines of 2 non-Japanese engineers, and after quite a few years now, they have many, many more. They probably towards 100, if not more. And of course, the company itself has grown a lot, and I can't claim that I helped do all of that. But I still do it and still provide a bit of training, advice, seminars, and things like that to kind of aid their communication. And it was an interesting niche as well, just having a real interest in the language side of things, and of course the language-based startup, but also being well-versed in tech in both languages.
Okay, so you were continuing to work as a software developer at that point too, or did you quit that and you were just running the company, and then the company was working with this larger company to help with the internet?
Yeah, so I kind of finished working as a software developer for other contracts, and I was just doing my company. And then of course, did work in consulting through that company to this.
Okay, so you had the idea for the product. It was kind of like the Grammarly type product. And did that not work out, and you ended up just doing the, I guess, consulting essentially, like internationalization consulting with the larger company instead, but like still through the same Kabushiki Gaisha, the company that you set up?
That's essentially how it turned out in the end. I was, thinking, well, this product's not going anywhere. Grammarly is much better, and they've got more money than us and more marketing. There was a time when every YouTube ad was Grammarly. We just weren't getting the same kind of traction. And so it made sense, just to focus on that kind of consulting stuff. But again, the visa issues come back in, and of course you're not allowed to run and manage a company on what would have then become the engineering, humanities, international services status. So that led me to essentially close the company and become a freelance consultant and engineer based purely as an individual.
Did you get the business manager visa for a bit while you were doing the company, or?
So I did not. I was in the process of that, and I think the combination and timing of things was like, maybe it makes sense to just close the business.
Yeah.
And then transfer the contracts from the business to myself. And again, it's a lot of paperwork when really you want to be focusing on actual work.
Yeah. You didn't have like a native Japanese speaking co-founder or anything like that? Yeah, so that's
no,
one.
I didn't.
I mean, one common piece of advice people say is like, you're going to want someone who's, even if you're really good at Japanese, you can get bogged down in a lot of that stuff, just dealing with all the accounting, and it's really tough if you're not like basically a native level speaker. Right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's really impressive that you even gotten set up and everything just on your own.
Yeah, I think I would say if you're going to do a startup, definitely have a co-founder and know your own weaknesses. Know what you're pretty good at and know what you're not good at. And I would say things like accounting and that paperwork side is not one of my strong points. And if I were to do it again and start a company again, I'd really be looking for a co-founder who's kind of got a mind for that type of thing.
I think what I always tell people is start as a sole proprietor, and because that's super simple to set up. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. Basically, you can even take some advantage of like various programs and stuff to like expense things to the business and stuff. And you don't need to have an accountant on retainer who you're paying monthly and doing these special confusing things and stuff because it's not technically a company. It's basically just you. And up until you hit like a certain revenue level, it makes sense to just do that, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. I'm a sole proprietor now, and almost kind of coming back around to the kind of, maybe I should start a company again just because, income levels and taxes and stuff. But I'm kind of, maybe because of my previous experience, I'm thinking, I'm happy as a sole proprietor. The tax return is pretty simple, and I think maybe this is good for me right now.
I think technically, like, it's all very complex, but if you're making like pretty good money then through that sole proprietorship, it does hit this kind of threshold where you start paying more tax than you would be if you had just had the company. But there's all these extra like expenses, and then it's like also just the mental load that it comes with the company, right? Where it's like, even if you're paying a bit more taxes or whatever, it can still be worth it. There can be like kind of a premium that it's worth it to just keep that sole proprietorship until it's like really big gap in terms of what you'd be paying, right? So that's what I always tell people too. Absolutely. And I've actually talked to a few other people who've done the same thing, like kind of had this idea to start this business. They set up the Japanese Kabushiki Gaisha or whatever, KK or GK sometimes, then ultimately just decide to close it and then like go back to being a sole proprietorship or just go back to kind of freelancing or whatever. It's a lot to deal with. And yeah, it's really tough. So it's a common story that I hear, unfortunately. And I wish it was easier. I wish there was less friction involved in that. But I think the solution, at least for relatively small businesses, you can at least do the sole proprietorship thing. So that was like your main thing, I guess, for a while. But did you end up doing any other? I mean, you didn't like go work full time at a company again, right? After that point.
No, I didn't. So after that, I continued that consulting work, and again, mostly through introductions, connections, referrals, and other things, picked up other work in sort of smaller tech companies. I think startups, like I said before, they're willing to be more flexible with working arrangements because they've got things that need to get done. They have some money, but hiring takes a long time and is quite expensive. And if you hire wrong, that's a huge cost as well. Whereas a contractor can be seen as a bit lower risk and maybe, more temporary, which can be useful for some companies. And so, and that's kind of just flowed into what I do now, where I do some more sort of advisal consulting type stuff, and some more, direct hands-on dealing with legacy code, doing rewrites, dealing with kind of more niche web stuff. I do more 3D on the web and things like that these days. But I like it, and it's a fun way to work because you get to, you get to touch a lot of different tech stacks. You get to kind of do something new all the time, which I really enjoy. Yeah, and I just feel like I have a very, very broad tech experience now. I get to just see lots of how things work.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting that you can kind of like pick and choose on like a project basis, and you'd be like, it's been a while since I've done some like front end or whatever, some back end, or use this technology or done this kind of project. Like maybe I'll find one of those and like pick something up like that, sharpen those skills again or whatever. It gives you a lot of flexibility. Because I think, if you're doing a mixture of like hard kind of tech focused work, more like consulting skills, things that require more like soft skills, you can start to miss one or the other. If you switch, for example, from like being an engineer to being a manager, then you might miss the engineering part. But with you can kind of go back and forth depending on like how you feel, right? So that must be nice to have that flexibility.
Yeah, and it's nice to have that flexibility and also have the flexibility in terms of maybe the negotiation, in terms of money as well. If you don't want to do something, you can, maybe this one's a bit more boring and this one's a little bit less interesting. Well, you can quote higher and quote lower, and you have that level of flexibility, which as an employee, I don't think you really have.
I think a lot of people want to start a business, and I feel like the first step is basically that, where like going from just a prescribed monthly paycheck to this idea of like, I can suggest this amount or this amount, and based on that, there's a percentage chance that they say yes versus this, this percentage chance, right? And then just being able to see there's not a direct correlation between the time spent and the money that you receive, right? And that it can actually be kind of controlled, and I guess just getting like stepping away from that monthly prescribed paycheck to like the more like project-based way of doing things, I think is freeing. I don't know if that's been your experience. Or I guess you were kind of doing that from, yeah.
Well, I don't have as much experience of a paycheck, so it's always when I speak, people say, "Oh, it's the 15th of the month payday." And I'm like, "What does that feel like?" I never really had it.
For me, it was a big like mental stumbling block when I was trying to start my business, because I had I was working at Mercari as an engineering manager, and I had like a pretty good paycheck and everything coming in, and it just felt so scary to like leave if I felt like I could probably make a similar amount, from the business or whatever. It was just like, it's a guarantee every month, it's just, I know for a fact it's going to be there, this amount, and I can plan based on that. Whereas the business, it's like, if I work really hard, maybe I can make even more. If I don't work hard, I'll make less, and there's the market, everything, things could shift or whatever, it's really hard to predict, I guess. So getting over that was really tough for me. And I think maybe I even stayed working a 9-to-5 for longer than I really wanted to be 100% honest, because partially just of that fear, of not wanting to do that. But it sounds like you overcame that very early on.
Well, I sidestepped that by, just never really experiencing it. So. And I think it's easy to, think the grass is greener on the other side. And I wonder, like, what my career would look like if I had, really shot for big tech companies at the start of it. And maybe I would be stuck. Maybe I would have the golden handcuffs of a great salary, and I'd never want to leave that. So there is definitely pluses and minuses to both routes. And the market 10 years ago is different to the market now as well, if you're a software engineer. So I think it's good to know there is another side to things.
Yeah, definitely. I do think a lot of people get really scared of going out on their own, and I rarely see it really backfire. Like I feel like worst case scenario, you can always kind of go back to just working a 9-to-5 somewhere.
Right.
And often like having that, even if it's a relatively short period where you're like on your own, doing that like branding and having to sell, yourself and your services and gaining that kind of experience. If anything, it usually makes you more valuable when you do go back to just being an employee, because it allows you to kind of think more with like a sales marketing kind of mindset, and just gives you like that perspective, I think. So I think it's a bit overblown, the fear that you can feel as a result of that, but it's definitely understandable though.
Yeah,
So.
and maybe it feeds back to this recurring topic of, if you're going to try and do it in Japan, you better have your visa sorted out.
That's true.
So, and maybe this brings me on to a little bit about, Fukuoka City really trying to get more engineers and do a lot of more startups, foreign and domestic run.
Yeah.
It's something of a stumbling block for maybe people wanting to take that first step. I think, what if it all goes wrong? I don't have to just go get another job. I maybe have to go move somewhere else, sort all that stuff out. But maybe we should talk about the Engineer Cafe a little bit.
Yeah, let's absolutely do that. I mean, I think I have seen a bunch of stuff coming up about Fukuoka. I know that they have a bunch of different kind of initiatives from like the startup to, just various subsidies and things like that I know that they're trying to attract startups to actually come and start in Fukuoka and not somewhere else. I see lots of news basically about this, but I am super interested to hear like your kind of on the ground report of like what it's actually like there, how much progress has been made, I guess, in that sense of like making it more of a startup hub and like what's actually kind of going on.
Yeah, as someone who's worked in some of these startups and done my own startup, and now I'm still very much in the area. I think Fukuoka City has done a lot of good to try and improve this stuff. So you mentioned the startup visa, which is sort of relaxed requirements to get onto a business manager visa to make it easy to come and do a startup. Originally, if you had a business manager visa, you'd often get caught in this situation of, oh, I need a bank account, but to get a bank account, I need an address. But to get an address, I need a bank account, and I can't solve that. And so the startup visa is one of those things that makes it much smoother to do some of that paperwork. And it was first done in Fukuoka and then has been kind of copied and taken to other places around, and including Tokyo, right? Shibuya, I think. So a lot of like new things, new ideas are coming from here. Fukuoka is maybe somewhat limited because things like immigration law and policy is all national, so they can't like make. It's much harder for them to go, make a new type of visa and things like that. In terms of things that are going on in the city, so there's Fukuoka Growth Next. It's an old primary school, actually, and it's been converted into startup offices, advisors for people wanting to run startups, co-working spaces. And so that's where I was with my office space, and it's really good value. So I would say things like that, the kind of basic infrastructure, if you're running a company, can about as smooth as you can reasonably get it in Fukuoka. They have advisors on hand to help with sort of immigration issues and accounting issues as well, and just sort of general information, as well as, the actual offices, which when I was there was a very, very good deal.
Is it free, or how does that work?
It's not, so Fukuoka Growth Next is not quite free, but it's subsidized. But where I work, the Engineer Cafe, which is another building, is completely free. It's a hacker space designed purely for engineers and designers, people who are interested in engineering. And we're based in this huge red brick building designed by the same architect as Tokyo Station, and you can kind of see the similarity. So,
I was going to say, it looks kind of, it has a similar vibe to Tokyo Station. It's a really cool building.
It's a fantastic space. And so we have like a big main hall where we can run tech events. And then we have a sort of basement maker space where we've got, again, 3D printers, laser cutters, CNC machines, soldering, microcontrollers, all sorts of hardware available completely for free for anyone to use. If you want to learn this stuff, up your skills. And so that, to me, is Fukuoka City putting money where their mouth is. They're putting money into these projects which are, genuinely helpful for engineers. And in my work there, I've done lots and lots of workshops, training. I've done lots of one-on-one consultations of people trying to career change into tech. And like during COVID, we had people who had just come, they'd been furloughed or they'd been laid off, and they would come and study every day. And in 9 months, a year, some of these people went from very basic programming knowledge to getting a full-time job and getting their first full-time job. So I think it's a really fantastic opportunity for anyone kind of in Fukuoka or Kyushu to kind of get into that.
That must have been like super rewarding to see that, like, for example, someone who was furloughed from their position because of COVID, getting into coding and kind of tech as a result of that, and then getting a job through that, and being able to kind of get past that difficult time in their life, thanks to like what you guys are doing there. I mean, we've had multiple people in that situation go from no programming experience to kind of training up, and obviously they were very hard workers and they were very dedicated to studying, but it is fantastic to see these things happen again and again. It is. It's maybe a bit of a funny story how I got the job there, actually. I'm curious about that, because you're a community manager there at it's called the Fukuoka Engineer Cafe. And how did you kind of get involved with the organization?
So even before then, like I said, I've been involved with lots of kind of community stuff in Fukuoka. And so I think I was like a known person because of some of that stuff. And I'd run programming workshops for various people before. You know, I was really big on sort of bilingual programming workshops back then. And I remember going to the opening ceremony just because I was interested in what was going on, and just sitting on one side, listening to the mayor give a speech, listening to the panel discussion. And, you know, things were going on, and I was sort of 2 hours in, and I'm thinking, what am I going to have for lunch? What's going on? Kind of getting a bit distracted. And someone asked a question about diversity of engineers in Fukuoka. And the mayor grabs the mic and says, well, I don't think I should answer this. I think he should answer this, and just hands me the microphone. He's a bit of a showman. He's good at PR. And so I could cobble together an answer while I was kind of staring out the window. But... Wow. Yeah, that put me on the spot a little bit. The picture is hanging around somewhere. There's a picture of me and the mayor. You know, I think it's on his Facebook page or something. But because I think, you know, because I've been in the community and been to all these events and done workshops myself, they said, hey, do you want to be a community manager here? Do you want to run more workshops and kind of build up the community even more? And I said, yeah, that sounds great. And of course, this was the end of 2019. So we had a great thunderous start, and then COVID hit, and because we were city run, we had to close alongside all the libraries and public offices and stuff. So it was a real tough year. That first year was very, very hard. We did online events. We did as much as we could, but you could definitely feel the energy was not quite the same. I know Japan and Fukuoka especially can contrast to other countries like the UK. We didn't have any kind of formal lockdown. But I remember walking through the middle of town here at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, and it was like being in a zombie movie. You know, there was no one there. In what would normally be streets full of people going out, going to bars, going to restaurants, it was very eerie. So the first year of being a community manager and running this stuff was tough, but we sort of started to get back into it, and the community started coming. And one of the things that I think really appeals to me about the Engineer Cafe is because we don't have to worry about that monetary aspect. We can host events where you'll only get 3 people. You know, we can host an event for something really obscure. It's like, hey, you like APL and vector programming languages? Get in here. You've got a room and we're not going to charge you for it. And I think that people can feel that in the community. They're like, we can do the events we actually want to do. And sometimes they are big, sometimes like 50 people, and we fill out the room and do big hackathons and other community events. But sometimes it's just small groups making, you know, esoteric things. You know, someone was making a microcontroller-controlled agricultural plumbing system. And I was like, that's fantastic, I love it. And we had, a few weeks ago, he was maybe 11, 12-year-old, end of primary school, came in and was saying, yeah, I'm just going to hit this API, get this data, send it over here. And I'm like, wow, you could probably get a junior dev job, no problem. And we continue to provide a lot of this resources to the community. You know, we've got Apple Vision Pro, which is quite an expensive device that maybe your average person can't just go and buy one to develop on. But if you come to the Engineer Cafe, you can do development on it, you can try it out. And we're going to do a big hackathon next month. So we're going to have, I think, 5 devices. We've borrowed some. And so every team can have a Vision Pro.
That's really cool. So is it like mostly Japanese language still, or is it a mixture of English and Japanese? Or are there like some events and stuff like that happening in English as well? Or like what's the breakdown for that?
Yeah, it's majority Japanese, I'll be honest, because the community here in Fukuoka is very Japanese language heavy, although it's definitely becoming more and more international, more and more English. We get a lot of just drop-in visitors, some really interesting people. They're here for a conference, they're here on holiday, and they just come and have a look and say hi. We have a sort of the English-speaking community here in Fukuoka, and we have some regular events with that. And I really try and be creative in how I put together sort of bilingual events. So sometimes I'll do the same workshop once in English and once in Japanese. Or I'll do kind of workshop with a sort of social thing sandwiched in the middle, and then the first half is English, the second half is Japanese, and so people can kind of come and go a bit and do whichever language they want. And we're also getting more and more connections with places like Taiwan, Singapore, and Korea. And I think Fukuoka is quite a good location for these places. And if you wanted to sort of start a startup in Asia, it can be a great place for like an Asian hub.
When you are having these connections, like you said, with places like Taiwan. Is that happening in English then at that point?
I think usually Taiwan's a bit special because there's quite a lot of Japanese speakers, but
Yeah, true.
but it tends to be more in English. And I would say
And like,
engineers do kind of speak quite good English because they in the documentation they're using it. Maybe their spoken English is not as good as their written, but yeah.
yeah, I see. That's awesome. I think it sounds like a really great kind of organization. It's really cool that you're so focused on trying to help the community kind of grow there. And I guess I'm curious, like, what still needs to happen? Like, it sounds like you are trying to make it more international and attract more and more interest in the city as a tech hub. My question is, like, what has not happened yet that, like, really needs to in order to kind of get to the next level and make it, like, super well known, like, throughout Asia or even, like, throughout the world, kind of startup destination?
Yeah, I think today, if you are going to start a company in Fukuoka, I think it's a fantastic place to start a smaller sort of bootstrap company. Sometimes people call them, a lifestyle company, a small tech company.
Right.
Maybe you're doing a software as a service, kind of international reach, and you just need a place to call home. I think your costs would be very low, and the general sort of infrastructure in Fukuoka would be great for that. However, I think where we really fall down is on the money side of things. I think we don't have the robust kind of community of VCs and angels and incubators and all this other stuff. And I've seen it quite a lot where some very good founders are here and they're going up to Tokyo quite a lot. And then, we're gonna move to Tokyo. We're gonna found in Tokyo. Things like that. And I think even just recently I heard a Fukuoka-based founder who think he had connections with Canada, and so he went to Canada for funding because realistically it was just not the right environment for him. So I think there's probably a lot of opportunities if someone's had a big exit and they kind of want to be the only angel in town, or they want to start an accelerator or something, hit me up because I could, I'll give you my Rolodex. But yeah, I think we struggle on the money side of things, but it wouldn't take that much to change it. I think a little money would go a long way here.
Yeah, I had the same thought actually when you were saying that. I was like, wow, so there's a bit of a vacuum, it sounds like. So anyone who did kind of step in, who was just a little bit more willing to lend to companies there, could probably have their pick of the top startups in the area that are trying to really start up there. That's interesting though. I mean, there's a decent amount of VC now, 10 years ago, this was not the case, but now in Tokyo, there's a decent amount. But I guess what is holding back the VCs in Tokyo from investing and just helping people that are in Fukuoka start
I'm not sure. I don't really have a lot of insight on that one. And I think maybe there's an aspect of Tokyo is the default. If you're going to be flying up to Tokyo or on the Shinkansen up to Tokyo all the time, well, why not just pick Tokyo? So, especially, I guess, if you're doing a startup where you're so busy, you can't enjoy living in Fukuoka. So maybe there's that aspect. And maybe also Fukuoka competing with a more remote world as well. So, like, if you're doing a startup in Fukuoka, well, why not do it somewhere even cheaper to do a startup? Maybe there's somewhere that's more amenable to that. So I think that's our challenge as a startup city.
That's interesting. It sounds like it's almost competing with Tokyo in a way. Like the startups that are here are kind of getting absorbed a bit. Like Tokyo's a bit of a magnet. It's pulling it away from Fukuoka and towards Tokyo instead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed that with engineering talent as well.
Right. I was wondering if that was one of the issues actually that the VCs maybe point to is like a lot of the engineering talent, especially if it's like more of like an international type company. I don't imagine it would be as big of an issue if it was just like a domestic kind of Japanese focused thing.
Yeah, I think maybe the more domestic stuff and the smaller scale stuff. I mean, Fukuoka really does a good job as almost the capital of Kyushu, unofficially, right? The population here is very young. The population of Fukuoka is still growing compared to many places in Japan, which it's not growing. And I think you can tell when you walk around Fukuoka compared to walking around some other cities, you can tell it's a young city, which means there's lots of workers, there's lots of young taxpayers like that. But yeah, I noticed it from individuals who are they're looking around for work, maybe they lost a job or they got laid off or they want to make a change. And Tokyo ends up being the place they go. And they often, begrudgingly, they don't want to go to Tokyo. They want to stay in Fukuoka, or sometimes they end up coming back or trying to find ways to come back. And during COVID, we had a lot of people moving down here because their company had gone full remote. And they were Tokyo-based, and they said, well, I'm going to go live in Fukuoka, it's much nicer. And some of that has finished. I think really, I don't know if there's a sort of magic wand you could wave and suddenly pull it away. There is that kind of Tokyo black hole feeling sometimes. And I often, when I go up to Tokyo, I say, well, what have they got that we haven't? They both feel like great, huge cities you can live in. You've got everything you could possibly want, but you just spend half the money down in Fukuoka and have more time.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like the narrative around Tokyo is, I went there for work. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I love Tokyo so much. Like, it was like, that's where the jobs were. So I ended up here. That's why I'm here, And I see a lot of people who are like, if it weren't for the fact that I'm in the office, whatever, because most companies are at least back to hybrid remote, where they're in the office a few days a week or whatever. Like, if it weren't for that, I would love to like move out to Fukuoka or Hokkaido or wherever. But it's the jobs that I think are keeping a lot of people here. They want bigger apartments, more space. They want a yard, these things that you could potentially get somewhere in Fukuoka or at least around it. So I'm surprised they're not able to attract more people. I think they will get better and better at doing that, though. And I actually feel like now with like the VC funding, I think there's actually a bit of an excess potentially in the amount of funding that has happened. And from what I've heard, it's actually kind of tough to find good startups to invest in. So hopefully that will make even like the Tokyo-based VCs more willing to look at companies outside of Tokyo and in Fukuoka. But I don't know if that has been having an effect at all or not.
Yeah, I wonder. There's also the big things like semiconductor developments down in Kumamoto, which is very close to Fukuoka, really. I won from just driving through there, seeing how it's gone from essentially nothing to enormous factories, multiple factories, and the infrastructure that goes around them. So it'd be interesting to see if that has a bit more pull and just pulling more workers, pulling more people away from Tokyo.
I mean, I would say that I'm too concerned, but something that I think about sometimes is like the declining population. And now with like the weak yen, it's a little bit concerning, I suppose, when thinking about like the long term, like my life here in Japan. Like, do I want to be here long term? Is it going to be viable to continue to kind of run a business and make money here in Japan despite these kind of headwinds? And I guess I'm curious, like, are you concerned about that at all? I guess the backdrop of like trying to build up Fukuoka as like a startup hub. Are you like, is that like an issue that you think about? And like, if not, like, why not? And what do you think can be done to kind of overcome those issues?
Yeah, it's definitely something I think about. Travel around Kyushu quite a lot, and you definitely notice a contrast between Fukuoka and a lesser extent places like Kumamoto, and then smaller cities and communities. And you notice the aging population, these small towns in the mountains. It's really, how are they going to sustain themselves? What's going to be the solution there? But I also think that brings with it a lot of opportunities. If you're the sort of pioneering type and you're sort of looking for problems that need solving, startups that need building, I think you can see it all the way around Kyushu. There's things that need to be addressed. I also, and maybe it's less apparent in Tokyo because Tokyo's always been very international, but it's Fukuoka, since I moved here in 2011, has become much more international, much bigger foreign population in terms of people coming here for Korea, Nepal, India, Taiwan. All these different countries are really kind of building more and more connections with Fukuoka, and it's very apparent. I think there's a way through this difficult time. I think we have to really work out what's going on, and we have to acknowledge that it's probably going to be quite difficult as well.
Right. I mean, it's also a global kind of issue. I mean, particularly the declining population. It's not just a Japan thing at all. It's pretty much every developed country is going through some version of this. Japan may be a little bit faster than some other countries, so it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But it's gotten a lot of interest from tourists, at least, over the past couple of years. That's exploding, maybe especially in Tokyo, I don't know, but I think probably down in Fukuoka too, there's probably a lot more tourism, a lot of money potentially flowing in as a result of that, a lot of like just general interest, from outside Japan. There's just a lot of soft power basically that Japan is kind of gaining now, I think. And I don't know if that will directly turn into more people actually moving here and starting startups here and things like that. But I think it's a good sign though, that hopefully it can counteract some of like the headwinds as well. There's more interest also from like the surrounding Asian countries and places like that. I think there's a lot of potential for that too, even if it's not people from like the Western world and things like that as much. a lot of people I think are really interested in living in Japan. You can certainly have a great life here. It sounds like you have like a really awesome life down in Fukuoka. And I think, I'm optimistic, despite some of the potential issues. And I know that there are some hurdles that need to be taken care of. But I think, would you say that you're like bullish on Japan despite that?
Yeah, I think so. I would say I'm quietly optimistic.
Okay.
I think maybe there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of things said about Japan, but I think Japan's attitude towards these changes, it's very slow and then it changes all at once. And I think we're seeing more and more the sort of the end of the lifetime employment. Job changing is becoming a normal thing. And I think that's going to be really great for engineers here. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities to sort of make an interesting career. And I think, startups and the support from cities and Tokyo and Fukuoka, I think we're going to see more and more interesting startups. And just on an individual level, it's nice to be in the same place for such a long time, 14 years here, watching things improve around you, and watching people come and go and seeing, things are getting better and better. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you are, it sounds like you're still really enjoying your life in Fukuoka. And would you recommend it to someone who's maybe wanting to move to Japan, but they're not like a big city person, they're not super thrilled about the idea of living in Tokyo? Like, would you recommend it as a good option?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you're not a big city person, even though we've got more than 1 million people here, it really does feel like a very compact, easy to get around city. You can be at the beach or in the mountains within sort of 30 minutes. The quality of life here is great. I would say if you're early in your career, think carefully about how you want to build this career. And I think if you want to focus on that, maybe Tokyo is the right choice, or maybe somewhere in another country is the right choice. But I think you could make a move to Tokyo in a few years, move to Fukuoka in a few years after that quite easily. So I think the door's always open.
Interesting. Yeah. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, a lot of companies have gone back to in-office or at least hybrid kind of remote work, as opposed to being 100% remote. But there are a few companies now that will let you work remotely. And one way to kind of get the best of both worlds is to work for a Tokyo-based company, but then work from Fukuoka. And then sometimes you can get like maybe a little bit higher salary from the Tokyo-based office, but then actually be spending in Fukuoka where everything is cheaper. And that can be a really great way to, like I said, kind of have your cake and eat it too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or, of course, if you can figure out a visa, not everyone can do this, but like if you could work for an overseas company somewhere else who has a branch office here or something like that. There's different ways you can do it. But earlier on in your career, though, I think usually the simplest way is to just find a company, work for them, like you mentioned, be doing Tokyo for a bit. Once you get tired of it, then come out to Fukuoka once you have a little bit more experience. And like, you don't need to be, directly working in the office with like whether it's like English speaking people or whatever. There's, maybe a few more of those in Tokyo, but like, the thing is also you only need like one company, one environment, and there's enough, like Fukuoka is a big enough city too that there's options in both, there and Tokyo. So it's a great option actually. And I'm a little jealous sometimes when I look at the real estate listings and stuff like that. It's
come visit.
Yeah, I need to. It's been too long since I've been down there. Yeah, Kyushu is great. I also hope at the very least that like as more and more people come and visit Japan, that they go to, like they make it down to Kyushu, because it's one of the nicest parts of Japan, in my opinion. Some really great, both the cities and like the nature around it are amazing. So I hope that, there's, it's not as concentrated in just like Tokyo and Osaka and places like that, and more people get to see places like Fukuoka. But yeah, it's a great place. Yeah, I guess lastly, you've already shared quite a few insights and maybe some tips on like things that you would have done a little bit differently. But if you were to kind of sum up, like if there are any things that based on, like if someone wanted to kind of do something similar, move to Japan or maybe move to Fukuoka and have like a kind of a similar path as a software engineer, like is there any advice or tips that you would kind of give them to make it as smooth as possible?
Yeah, I guess my first advice would be like, freelance is really quite playing on hard mode, so maybe don't do it unless you're really set on it or you have a good reason to do it, things like visas and things like that. My advice for that side of things as well is just be absolutely meticulous in your record keeping, your accounting, your record keeping, and just paperwork, and just be really on top of that from day one, because if you can get caught out and you get into tricky situations, which better record keeping might have helped you. I would also say like really trying to find that team with the experience to kind of teach you things during the early parts of your career. And I think that could be as a full-time employee, and it could be as a contractor, and it could be in lots of different ways. Really seek out those people who you can learn from, because I think it was only maybe 9 months where I worked with this one particular person, but it just taught me so many things about the craft of software development. And I guess consider all your options outside of Tokyo. I mean, definitely come visit Fukuoka, see if you like it. I would recommend come here 2 or 3 weeks. Don't think of it as sightseeing, think of it as like a trying living here. Because all the great things about Fukuoka are the day-to-day stuff. All the restaurants, all the kind of things you can just stroll along the street to, go to an outdoor food stall, and then go to the park, do this, do that, go to the beach. There's just get a taste of life in Fukuoka and then make up your mind.
Right. At least make an informed decision. Don't just go to Tokyo because it's Tokyo or whatever, right? It might not be the best place for you. I think that's great advice. Cool. So I guess if anyone wants to maybe reach out to you and learn more about like Fukuoka, what you're doing there, or like maybe get some more tips directly from you on how to maybe move there, or learn more about starting a company or there, or anything like that, is there any way that they can kind of reach out to you?
The best way is probably go via my personal website. It's on my GitHub.
Okay.
It links to the various different ways to reach out to me.
Okay.
If you want to talk to the Engineer Cafe and all the other people there as well, there's an Engineer Cafe Discord. I'm sure we can link to that, which is a great way to chat to many people in Fukuoka. But my kind of inbox is always open. I'm always interested to hear from people thinking about moving here, looking for advice, and all sorts of different opportunities like that.
All right. We will definitely go ahead and link to those also in the description for anyone who is interested in kind of learning more about that, or what's it called? Startup Cafe.
Yes, Startup Cafe, Engineer Cafe.
Yeah, in Fukuoka. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's a really unique story that you have, and I think very illustrative for a lot of people who don't want to just get caught in like the Tokyo big city grind and want to live like a more intentional kind of like maybe slightly like slower paced, calmer life out in Fukuoka, which I think is super interesting for a lot of people. So it's really cool to see how you were able to make that happen and be, very successful. And yeah, I think, like I said, it's chock full of insights for anyone who, whatever they want to do here in Japan. I think there's a lot they can learn from your story. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a great time.
Awesome. And yeah, so if anyone is watching this, you want to see more content like this, we will continue to do more interviews. So please like the video, definitely subscribe to the channel, and leave us a comment. I'll take a look, make sure to reply to any comments that we receive. So let me know what you thought. Thank you so much. And that's it for this episode of the Japan Dev Podcast. Thanks.